Have you ever felt just completely exhausted by this simple act of trying to figure out what your life actually means? Well, let's dive right into that today. We're going through an explainer of this incredibly profound existential framework from a novel called The Confession of Nobody in Particular and Veld. It tackles some really heavy, often unspoken burdens, things like modern dread, burnout, and that crushing weight of trying to figure out what it all adds up to. And what's great is it completely strips away those glossy, toxic positivity self-help narratives and just looks directly at the raw mechanics of simply existing. Actually, we're skipping the usual agenda today to drop right into the deep end with this staggering quote from a character named Vera. She says, "The problem is not that life is meaningless. The problem is that it almost means something all the time, and that almost is what destroys you." Wow, right? I mean, that perfectly captures this modern fatigue of constantly searching for meaning. It's not total nihilism that we're struggling with. It's that tantalizing almost. We're just exhausted because coherence always seems like it's just one realization or one achievement or one relationship away, but then it continually recedes. That perpetual gap is literally what grinds us down.
So, this brings us to the core dilemma for us today. How exactly do we survive in the almost? The source material tackles this through two completely different characters who are both trying to endure the crushing weight of reality. And spoiler alert, they don't use neat, easily packaged solutions, they don't magically fix their lives, but they do learn how to endure them. And honestly, the methods they discover are absolutely fascinating and intensely practical for anyone dealing with burnout or, that classic 3 a.m. paralysis of overthinking.
Okay, let's move right into part one, the room, and this idea of the paralysis of thought.
So the text introduces our first subject, Antónin. He's a man whose response to life's profound uncertainty is to just completely retreat into his own mind. He suffers from what the book brilliantly terms a gray year. Now, to be clear, this isn't traditional depression. Instead, it's more of a metabolic crisis caused by overthinking his own existence. You know, when you wake up and suddenly the actual reason for making coffee or going to your job just totally evaporates? Yeah, that's the gray year. The generative spark of daily life goes quiet, and he is left with literally nothing but the bare, empty architecture of his daily habits. He's just forced to exist without a why.
And this brilliantly illustrates this huge dichotomy between Antónin and his brother Pavel. While Antónin is stuck inside these corrosive internal mental loops inside his dimly lit room, questioning the self, Pavel takes the exact opposite approach. Pavel builds a shield out of external momentum, hustle, career, outward success. He works from the outside in, just refusing to slow down long enough to question anything. So Antónin analyzes the foundation until he's completely paralyzed, whereas Pavel just keeps building the roof so he doesn't ever have to look down.
But here's the thing. Antónin realizes something critical about his brother's outward momentum. What do you do when the fixed points don't hold? What do you build the self around when the load-bearing walls turn out to be assumptions? Pavel's fixed points, his job, his status, his firm, they're actually super fragile. They are walls that could instantly collapse under the right amount of pressure. Antónin is terrified because he sees that these external structures society tells us to build our identities around, they are fundamentally precarious.
So, if Antónin is paralyzed by thinking too much, this naturally begs the question, what happens to someone who is broken by doing too much? Like, what actually happens when that external armor, those load-bearing walls of hustle and outward success, completely shatter? Which pivots us right into part two, the field, focusing on the burnout of action. This brings us to a character named Sever. He's a doctor defined entirely by flawless execution and external results. But Sever experiences a total collapse after a patient of his, named Mila, dies. But here is the absolutely critical part. She didn't die because Sever made a mistake. The medicine was right, the protocol was flawless, the execution was perfect, and she died anyway. Sever runs headfirst into what's called the limits of precision. It's this terrifying realization that your singular identity, in his case, being this ultimate savior of medical precision, is ultimately an insufficient shelter against the totally chaotic reality of life. So to recover from this devastating failure of precision, Sever does the exact opposite of Antónin. He abandons the room of his mind and retreats to the field. He leaves the city. He leaves that relentless internal questioning and the urge to figure it all out, and instead forces a reconnection with the raw physical facts of his body and nature. He walks through tall grass. He feels the sun on his neck. He looks at the unedited starlight. He essentially forces himself to exist strictly below the neck. Now, what I found really fascinating about this realization is how it exposes the profound danger of merging your entire identity with your career or your output.
Sever realizes he used his medical precision as a way to avoid dealing with the rest of his existence. So when that precision failed to save Mila, he was left entirely empty. He had built literally no other structures to sustain himself. As Sever processes this out in the field, he confronts the book's ultimate, subversive anti-self-help question. You see, our culture is completely obsessed with the redemptive arc, right? We demand that every tragedy teach us a lesson, that every burnout make us stronger, that every loss somehow be worth it in the end. But what if it isn't? What if our trauma isn't a curriculum that we are supposed to graduate from?
Let's look at part 3, staying with what's real, and how we actually go about enduring existence.
This next concept really shifted my perspective. Instead of a lesson, Sever learns to see his grief as a shape. Think about it. A wound is active and painful, but eventually it closes and it becomes a shape, a scar. It stops being a story you tell yourself over and over, and it stops being a lesson you frantically try to decode. It simply becomes permanent information. It is the body's faithful record of what happened. You don't get over it, and you don't extract wisdom from it. You just carry its shape.
We see this beautifully illustrated in Sever's elderly landlord, Agata, who tends a garden in the village. Her husband died 20 years ago, and her timeline of grief is just brutally honest. For 5 years she was angry. For 3 years she was sad. And then? Well, there was no profound epiphany, no magical healing. Just, here is enough. The sheer endurance of it finally led to a quiet, totally unglamorous acceptance of reality. So how do we actually do this in our own lives? Well, the text advises us to drop that toxic positivity that constantly demands a redemptive arc. We have to refuse consoling fictions. We must accept that we might never feel entirely whole or merged. Instead, we endure by focusing intensely on the small reals, the taste of morning coffee, the angle of the light coming through a window, the physical sensation of walking. We just let the wound be a fact.
And this leads us to what might be the most powerful takeaway of the whole explainer. When you lose your why, when you enter that gray year or suffer total burnout, you don't sit around waiting for the reason to come back before you act. You act first. You continue the daily practice without a reason. You make the coffee, you take the walk, you do the work. The reason isn't a foundation you build on. Rather, the reason is the residue of your practice. It accumulates slowly, purely through the act of doing.
Whether you're an overthinker crippled by interiority like Antónin, or a doer crushed by the limits of your external actions like Sever, the destination is exactly the same. The only real arrival is accepting the present moment exactly as it is, without requiring it to be part of some grand, meaningful storyline. It is simply here, this, now.
I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought to examine in your own life. We spend so much energy demanding that our suffering means something, that our burnout teach us a lesson, that our fixed points last forever. But when those fixed points fail, and if you simply stopped demanding a redemptive narrative from the universe, what shape would you be left holding? Think about that as you navigate your own almost theme.